found in terms of tax rates, which I think are really worth exploring. One was personal tax rates, and the other was variously called consumption taxes, VAT, GST, around the world. Personal tax rates, and the research was really interesting on this. At the beginning of the period, those tax rates are really quite high and have probably dropped away in most cases, but are still recognised as being quite high. So there's two counter forces at play here. There's one force at play that says, well, raising personal tax rates is easily the most efficient way to raise money. It's a very, very efficient way to raise tax. But at the same time, the environment in 2014 is so different to the environment even 20 years ago. Global mobility is just the norm. People don't think about, they might think about whether they're in Europe or Asia, but they certainly wouldn't think about whether they do business in one country versus another country. So global mobility is absolutely the norm. And business, government, regulators want to attract the most talented people. And tax rates are an incentive, and therefore there's a trade-off going on here. So again, it was a really interesting thing to see that on the one hand, it's a great source of revenue, but on the other hand, attracting talent is the huge issue. So there's a really interesting dynamic going there as to which one is going to play out, and I suspect there'll be different answers in different places. So that was a really interesting part of the piece. Now, the other piece we found very interesting was rates of consumption taxes and VATs and so forth. Now, the direction of those taxes since they were introduced has by and large been just one direction. They continue to increase, and even if they were introduced on a fairly narrow band of goods and services, then the band of services has increased as well. So not only does the rate increase, you have a rate increase and you also have a breadth increase as well. So those are clearly going to increase. We tried very hard in the surveys to see whether there were any decreases in consumption taxes, but there certainly weren't. So it really tells you that once the escalator starts moving up, it's not going to stop, and it's certainly not going to go down. So rates was interesting. Perhaps if I can turn to just a couple of other areas which I think are interesting, and one is double tax agreements. Again, you only need to do a search on the web and a quick media review, and you'll find tax agreements comes up. People talk about tax treaty shopping is a phrase that's used. People talk about treaty abuse. Technical phrases are used, such as limitation of benefits and so forth. If you unwrap that, what that really is about is double tax agreements or tax treaties were in place to really allow countries to work out whether country A or country B was able to tax a particular activity, and then how they would tax that activity. Those agreements, in many cases, have been long-standing. So if we go forward to a complex digital economy of 2014, there's a perception, rightly or wrongly, there's a perception that those agreements don't work effectively. So both governments, the OECD and other interest groups have really created an environment where change is being talked about. There's an environment that says, if these agreements don't work, then we need to look at something new. Whether you accept that point or not, one of the really interesting things that our research played out was the enormous amount of difficulty that will happen country to country in terms of implementing. So the strategy might be agreed, even the means to get the strategy might be agreed, but the legislative framework, the political environment within country to actually make those things happen is a dynamic that is only really beginning. So our research said, yeah, we're expecting change, but there certainly wasn't a clear outcome as to where that change would go.